Hello and welcome to another episode of Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm your host, Giulia Bottaro, and I'm here with my co-hosts, Heather Dinwoody and Felicia Jackson. As always, today we have 3 stories that caught our eye from last week, followed by an interview with a change maker. So Felicia, why don't you take it away?
Okay, so I am back on the subject of carbon offsets. Now, I know this is an area that a lot of people find very confusing because obviously lots of companies use them, but there's been a lot of complaints. And the latest piece of news is a report that BP-owned Finite Offsets has been promoting offsets that don't do anything for climate change. So Finite Carbon was actually founded in 2009 and bought by BP in 2020. And it manages over 60 projects covering 1.6 million hectares, which actually generate about a quarter of all of the US's carbon credits. Now, where it gets complicated is for those of you who may remember, there was a lot of scandal last year around the offset market, basically to do with avoided deforestation. This idea that you would pay people to not cut down forests, and in exchange, those owners of forest could issue credits. So basically they get paid not to do something which is really bad. And since 2009, Finite says it's actually offset over 70 million tons of emissions. And that's an interesting number just because it's double what BP's reported total emissions were last year. The issue is, should these credits have been issued? So there's an agency called Renoster, which basically does verification of the extent to which carbon credits have a genuine climate benefit. And they're basically arguing that quite a lot of Finite's credits don't really have any direct benefit. Now, this is an ongoing argument. There was a thing from Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, back in May, where she issued a statement saying that, credits should be high integrity. Earlier this month, a group of NGOs, published a letter basically saying that carbon credits are a problem. They're arguing that all offsets do is provide a social license for high emitting actions to continue, and that the use of such credits are delaying real concrete climate action. One of the things that's very challenging about this is some of the research on companies that do use carbon credits in order to move forward with decarbonisation, is it does show that companies using carbon credits often do more in terms of actual limiting of carbon emissions, in terms of increasing efficiency, shifting to renewables, all of this kind of stuff. And in the end, I don't really know what to say about this, which isn't necessarily that helpful. The problem is I think both sides have got a really good point. Part of the challenge, I think, is that the media tends to oversimplify what's going on. They're conflating all the different types of carbon credit, and these are very, very different types available. But it's that thing of, what are you actually trying to achieve with a carbon credit? So I think that Mark Trexler, who was one of the architects of the earliest carbon credit systems, has basically outlined 2 different groups. You've got the argument that we shouldn't really be using carbon offsets because they facilitate greenwashing. They don't deliver on their intended climate benefits. They delay action. They basically allow companies like BP to continue to pay to pollute. And of course, not that this is relevant for the Finite Carbon story, but they're carbon colonialism. It's about companies in the global north saying, well, we can keep doing what we're doing, but because poor people are going to provide the offsets we need. At the same time, there's a valid argument that we need more carbon offsets, because while they aren't perfect, they are improving, and they'll keep doing so. One of the arguments about avoided deforestation is that was a concept that was come up with 20 years ago. The methodologies behind offsets are improving. At the same time, we now know we really need to take action on nature. Well, those offsets that bring nature co-benefits could be seen as really beneficial. There's the idea that it actually, offsets do help to promote cost-effective mitigation, that they're necessary to achieve net zero goals, that they actually provide revenue that's key to closing the climate finance gap, and that they can often, contribute to the welfare of communities in very challenging situations. The trouble with this is arguments on both sides seem to be anecdotally reasonable, and they could be made in good faith. The question is, how do we actually know, and how do we decide what to do?
So I think actually, Fee, you're really capturing the problem when you say arguments on both sides. That to me is the problem, is the fact that we have two sides, that we've made it this dichotomy of right versus wrong. Are they good? Are they bad? When in reality, if we could all sit round a table and say, like, yes, there are a lot of problems right now, but there are also some absolute necessities. How can we work together to make sure that all of our interests align? And, there are definitely some problems. I think the colonial aspect you touched on is something that still doesn't get spoken about enough. It's definitely getting better, but it's still not spoken about enough. And to me, it really does just seem like, okay, well, if we get everyone together and start doing these things as more grassroots projects, rather than big oil companies buying out a company and saying, right, that's us, offset our emissions. It needs to be collaborative. It needs to be a process. It can't just be me versus you.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And, we talk about this in politics. We talk about the importance of moving away from divisiveness. The thing is, if we spend all our time arguing, we don't move forward at all. And, I think one of the things that, again, as you say, is not discussed enough, which I think is a key issue, we haven't got that long to act. If you listen to most companies and most countries and most commentators, you're hearing a talk about, we need to be doing XYZ by 2050. The point actually is the target is net zero by 2050. That means we have to cut 45% of our emissions by 2030. Now, that is about 6 and a bit years away from now. I remember having a conversation about the financialization of nature, the idea of paying for the protection of nature, and how that philosophically that is an incredibly dangerous thing. The commodification of nature, the commodification of public goods is really dangerous. Now, I wholeheartedly agree with that as a concept. But I keep coming back to 5.5 years. I keep coming back to how do you change what people do and how they think in a really short space of time? And I remember something I heard, when I did my first startup, which is that thing of you've got to have momentum. You can't actually respond to changes if you're standing still. You have to keep moving. And this, Heather, comes back to your point that, we have to stop this being a binary situation. It's not either or, it's and. We have to use every single tool in the arsenal in order to be able to achieve effective change in the timeframes we have.
Sounds like we're going improv now. And yes, and I think it is they do. She
It
says as
is yes,
someone
and you're
who
quite
has
right.
never done improv in my life. But, speaking about the need for positive change, perhaps that's a good opportunity for me to introduce my story this week, which is about Nestle, who have developed a new strain of Arabica. I don't know.
Arabica.
Arabica. They've developed a new strain of I can't say that word. They've developed a new strain of coffee that is basically it's sort of bred to be more resistant to changes in the climate and to a particular sort of fungus that has been causing serious problems with coffee growth. And at the same time, it's also higher yielding and can be farmed with sort of more sustainable methods. So basically, it's more resilient to the climate changing, and it's going to contribute less to climate changing. And they do already have another couple of strains of coffee. They're Robusta, which I believe is just a slightly different plant from the one that they've developed now. But to me, this is really interesting because it shows all of these different things coming together in terms of why a business would choose to do something. Because, this looks great for them. They're doing great things, but they are also really securing the future of their business, the future of their supply chain. Because I think there's studies showing that by 2050, the area of land that is suitable for growing Arabica coffee will shrink by at least 50%, possibly more. And for a coffee drinker like myself, that is utterly terrifying. So for Nestle, yes, they're doing this good thing on the surface, being like, yay, we care about the planet. Now, I think we all know that Nestle has had a bit of a reputation over the years. So not only does this improve their reputation in a way, it shows their dedication to customers, to shareholders, but it's also securing that future supply chain, securing their future business. This, I hate to say it, but to Nestle, this probably is not about the planet and about the supply, like about the land, etc. And to me, there's a really interesting point to be made here about reputation, because Nestle hasn't always had the best reputation. And I worry when we sometimes tarnish a big company with a brush and just say, you're the worst of the worst, bottom, and never give them a chance. Like we do need to recognize good things when they happen, and also recognize that companies are made up of different people. And, even if this is different strategies, it's still strategists and decisions coming together
Credit where
in the right
credit is
direction.
due.
My question here is just how the new strain would impact biodiversity around it, whether these changes that are made at a small level enough that it feels like the old strain to the nature around it. Just to see whether there are any unexpected results. But it doesn't mean that I'm not appreciating the attempts. And I think when you were talking about strategy, it's like finally a company is thinking long term, because it feels that there is a lot of short termism when it comes to sustainability. And especially in the food industry, in agriculture, one of the most impacted sectors out there. It's definitely a positive and encouraging story. And it reminds me that I went to see a vineyard last year when I was on holiday in France, and they had dedicated an entire area of their cultivation to study different types of wines that normally would be grown in Spain, Portugal, Italy, or even California, because they were expecting higher temperatures in that area of France. And so they were expecting that that area would be as warm as maybe southern Italy. And so they were trying to understand how the different wines were growing there, which is terrifying. But again, it shows that some people know that change is coming, and it's coming fast.
This actually speaks, I think, very closely to my earlier point about the need to take action. Because, Heather, I'm with you, it's important to recognize what companies are doing. But what I think is really interesting is that any sensible business, when it sees that the costs in its supply chain are increasing rapidly, if they want to survive, they are going to find different ways, different sources, different approaches to how they manage their supply chain. In the last couple of years, we've seen worsening harvest conditions in areas of coffee production in Brazil, in Vietnam, in Colombia. We all know about the shipping disruptions in the Middle East. We've seen everything. Coffee now I think it's at a 15-year high within the supply chain, let alone what that actually does to the cost of coffee at the end, which is where you and I drink it. I think Lavazza has predicted that the next year is going to see an increase of 20 to 25%. That's just within the next year. So it's a really sensible strategic choice to start looking at your supply chain, to start looking at how sustainable your systems and your operations are. And actually, failure to do that, as far as I'm concerned, is a failure of fiduciary duty.
Absolutely. And I would also argue that, I mean, this may partly be tainted by my living in Brighton, but certainly like local roasteries, small ethical startups, like the consumer is looking for more ethical goods, and ethical coffee has become something that people do understand and do know about. Like coffee is spoken of as one of these goods that we do have to think about more. And I think people are starting to think about it more. So for Nestle as well, the reputational benefits combined with the supply chain benefits, it all comes together for them, but also for us, for the consumer who wants low cost coffee and wants to know that it's not destroying the planet. And yes, this might be a small step, but it is a step in the right direction, and it goes against what my sort of immediate reaction to Nestle is. But yeah, I think job well done and keep going, please.
And can I just add to that? What I really do love about this, because I always go on about how cross I get that, large multinationals have kind of turned the argument on its head and made it our responsibility. The reality is that we as individuals have choices, but of the choices that are put in front of us. It's the system that actually defines what we can and can't do. And if a company that's a fundamental part of that system is actually creating a bean that uses less water, that is hardier, that is more survivable, then that provides us with an option that is more positive. And as you say, Heather, that protects it operationally and reputationally.
And now I'm not talking specifically about Nestle, I'm talking about the entire coffee supply chain. Let's just make sure everyone is paid fairly across the whole thing. And yeah, maybe we can move to my story then, which is set in a completely different place in Copenhagen in Denmark. The city has launched this week a new initiative called Copen Pay. So the idea is that it's offering carrots to tourists, not actual carrots like carrot and stick. So incentives to tourists to behave well, behave consciously, and rewarding them. So for example, if you do a class at the Copenhagen Surf School, and after that you help with 30 minutes of beach cleaning, they will give you a free lunch. So, and there are other ways beyond picking litter. For example, if you commit to going around by bike, and there are various, I would say, awards that you can get, free lunch, coffee, kayak tour, museum entrances. And so the idea here is basically how to address what many European cities are facing, which is over tourism. So it's a really delicate balance because their local economies are counting on the tourists to carry on. But then at the same time, this very same amount of tourists is hurting the city in a way. And so I quite like this idea because it's not punishing anyone. It's not trying to have more tourists. It's not trying to reduce the numbers. And in this way, it's also benefiting the local environment. And I think, I'm from Italy, and in Italy, there is lots of tourists. If you think about Venice, Venice at this point is kind of seen more as an amusement park rather as an actual city. Not many people live there anymore. And recently the city introduced a tax whereby if you want to go into the city, you need to pay a tax. And that's because so many times people just go inside, have a tour around, maybe they buy an ice cream or a water, and then they leave. And so these are real issues that are affecting not only the local economy, but of course the environment, because it's put a massive burden on the local facilities for waste, for example, and how about water consumption. And so, yeah, I quite like it. And it's starting this week, and they're saying that they will see if it works. It's a pilot for now. So if it works, they will extend the program, and hopefully other cities can take inspiration from it.
So I love this for a few reasons, not just because I was actually quite hoping to go to Copenhagen next spring, and now I feel like I can do so in a positive way. But I think it's also really interesting because a lot of places in Europe right now are seeing massive, massive anti-tourist backlash. I know there's been protests all across Spain. I think there was something last week about people literally getting things like thrown at them and squirted with water pistols and stuff in Barcelona. So like the really in the past year or so, there has been this massive revolution against the tourist, and to me it just seems so. And I hate to be so stereotypical, but it just seems so Danish to be like, actually, we're going to come up with a nice way of doing this, of incentivizing responsible tourism rather than punishing the tourism that we don't want. It all just seems very democratic and sociable and yeah, pleasant. And I also think that there's a point to be made for the educational aspect of it.
I think the education part is so important because there's a couple of things going on with tourism, around climate change, which is the places we can go can change, but the volume of people is becoming really all encompassing. I mean, Julia, your point about Venice is very, very well made. I love the idea that there is a city that is saying, yes, we want tourism. Yes, we need tourism, but we also want tourists to understand the implications of what they're doing. And by introducing something like this, they are saying, think about the impact you have on where you're going. Think about how the decisions you make impact the people around you. And it's asking visitors, it's asking travelers to respect the city that they're visiting and, help make it a better place. And, there is one level at which just by bringing up the idea that you can help make somewhere a better place, you do make people think about things in a different way. And if you change the way in which people think, then you can change the way in which we can find solutions to problems.
Yeah, and this brings me back to what you said earlier, Fee, about the architecture of choice or choice architecture, one of the two. But basically, we all have options, and we all make choices based on what we have in front of us. Sometimes the options aren't great. So in this case, I think this initiative really invites the tourism industry to reinvent itself, and think how we can move forward. And this doesn't mean that there aren't loads of ecotourism initiatives out there. There's plenty that people can do when they want to travel sustainably. But the reality is that mass tourism at the moment is not done sustainably. So this is an interesting step.
And it's a wonderful, wonderful idea to just have that thought process in the everyday. You're visiting a city, we've got signs to stop littering, but I love the idea that you're going further and you're removing the unpleasantness and the detritus that's left behind. That's a really positive and wonderful thing and a way of moving forward.
Lovely. What a lovely, happy note to close on today. Well, not close because we're just taking a short break, which will be followed by the interview of the week. I'm joined today by Lucy Brooks, a sustainable finance advisor at the Norwegian company The Future in Our Hands. Lovely to have you here, Lucy. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Maybe we can just get started with a brief intro about what you do and your work. And also you can tell us the name of your company in Norwegian, because I just said the translation in English as well.
Yes, sure. Well, I'm a sustainable finance advisor, working to change banks and funds so they don't harm the environment and society, but rather use the money they manage to support the transition to a low carbon economy and move away from fossil fuels. So I work at an environmental NGO in Norway called Future in Our Hands. In Norwegian, it's called Framtiden I våre hender. And we have about 50,000 members that support us. And Future in Our Hands works to counteract the overconsumption in countries like Norway that's driving the climate and environmental breakdown and increasing global inequality. So I'm focusing on the Norwegian Oil Fund, which is also known as NBIM. I might refer to as NBIM. which is one of the 10 global financial actors that has the power to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels. So it's a very powerful fund, really. I could tell you a bit about the oil fund, just so a bit of background.
Yes, please. Yes, thank you.
So the Norwegian oil fund, known as NBIM, it's worth around 1.4 trillion US dollars, and it's the largest sovereign fund in the world, and it's designed to last forever for future generations of Norwegians. So it's invested in around 9,000 companies in 72 countries around the world, and it owns about 1.5% of all the world's listed companies. And it came about because discovery of oil in the 1960s in Norway created enormous wealth in a very short amount of time, and the fund was established to invest the revenue from the oil. And NBIM, who manage the oil fund, they have ethical guidelines about what they will and won't invest in. They won't invest in, for example, tobacco or nuclear weapons or landmines, for example. And that's products that cause severe harm to humans or severe harm to the environment. And now NBIM is heavily invested in fossil fuels and is Europe's largest fossil fuel investor. So personally, I would consider that companies that are driving the climate crisis, such as oil and gas companies that have huge plans to expand, are extremely harmful to people and the environment. Yeah. And 94%, I think, of the investments that NBIM has are that they have in fossil fuel companies are those companies are planning new projects, which goes against the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the oil fund does have a climate action plan, which explains its expectations from companies it invests in terms of transition plans and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah, so that's what I've been working with mostly.
So are there any plans, in the NBIM, for its investees? Are there any requirements for energy transition, for example?
They have laid out expectations from the companies that they insist that they want companies to follow, but these are not reflected in what NBIM actually does in those companies, which I'll tell you about.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, because I suppose, you can demand an energy transition all you want, but then if your investee is planning a new oil and gas field, it doesn't sound very energy transition to me.
Exactly. Because in order to transition to a low carbon economy, the money flows need to be directed away from oil and gas and have to be invested in low carbon projects and green energy. And you're probably aware that in 2021, the International Energy Agency and others made it very clear that if the world had any chance of succeeding to reach the Paris Agreement of limiting global warming to a maximum of 1.5 degrees, no new fossil fuel extraction projects should be established. So it's actually not just a question of climate risk. There's a high financial risk in investing in high carbon projects because the physical effects of climate change, such as extreme weather events and rising sea levels, they'll be very costly and directly impact operations in infrastructure. And there's also the financial risk that comes from regulatory changes and from stranded assets. So it's very important to keep asset managers and investors accountable for what they're putting money in, because oil and gas companies assessments have shown that a lot of the fossil fuel companies lack Paris-aligned business models. They're not aligned with Paris. And this year there was a comprehensive evaluation of the largest listed oil and gas firms, and it revealed that none of them are presently aligned with the Paris Agreement's objectives. Most of them are expanding to find new sources of oil and gas in new countries. And so NBIM, the Norwegian Oil Fund, is heavily invested in the fossil fuel giants like Shell, BP, Exxon, and Total. And just as an example, Total is a private company that approved the most new oil and gas projects in 2022. And it has a climate plan, but 200 scientists and experts have said that climate plan is totally inadequate. They're not transitioning. And so fossil fuel companies are making it very clear that they're not going to transition. They have long-term expansion plans, which actually make it impossible to achieve the Paris alignment. So that's what I've been looking at how MBIM is trying to influence these companies.
Yeah, I've seen some extracts of a podcast that the NBIM CEO did with some major figures in the oil and gas space, and I think it's clear that there is a real reluctance to leave oil and gas behind. So I'm quoting here Nikolai Tangen is the CEO of NBIM and says, he's talking to Wal Sawan, which is the CEO of Shell. And he's saying, is it a fantasy to think that we will phase oil and gas out? And someone says, well, I think in the coming years, one has to be pragmatic and look at the realities. We see oil and gas as a critical part of the energy system. And again, this doesn't sound very energy transition to me.
You're perfectly right. All of the major fossil fuel companies do not have a good transition plan. The Shell last year, weakened their climate transition plan. They abandoned some of the goals that they had. The CEO of Exxon has made it very clear that they are a hydrocarbons company and that they will continue with hydrocarbons. So yes, for them it's business as usual, and the plans that they have published, there's none of the experts believe that they're adequate. So it's very clear that they're just business as usual for them.
Can you tell me a little bit more about your research in the NBIM?
Yes. So NBIM, as I said, it's the biggest sovereign fund in the world and has a great deal of power to influence what happens. As investors go, NBIM has been quite progressive in some areas. It's more transparent than some other funds about what they're invested in and how they vote in AGMs. But unfortunately, they still haven't grasped the urgency of the climate transition and realize how big their influence is. And time is running out. It's almost 2025, and the biggest carbon dioxide emitters need to change course now. So some investment funds globally are divesting from fossil fuel, that is selling off their investments from those companies that don't align with the Paris Agreement. MBIM prefers to stay invested in high emitting oil and gas companies in order to influence them from the inside through engagement. They say to be a stone in the shoe of the oil companies, for example. So engagement means different things. It means active involvement and interaction between the shareholders, such as MBIM, and the company's management and board of directors. So the goal is to influence the company's practices and policies in order to improve corporate governance, environmental performance, and social responsibility. So you could do this through dialogue in meetings. The investor could have meetings with the company, and another way of engagement is voting at shareholder meetings, at the annual general meeting especially. And then also an investor could submit his own shareholder proposals to be discussed at the AGM to change policies or discuss new policies. So MBIM says that voting is very important to them to influence these companies. So the CEO of MBIM, Nikolai Tangen, he said in April this year that our voting is perhaps the most important way we have influence. So they think it's very important. Stay invested and influence from the inside. So you would expect the oil fund to be using their vote as much as possible to influence the oil companies and the fossil fuel companies such as Shell and BP and Exxon and Total, we've seen that their transition plans are inadequate. So I was looking at how MBIM voted in 2023 at climate resolutions that came up at these oil and gas companies. There aren't a lot of climate resolutions that come up. They're often proposed by smaller shareholders, but we found all the ones at the biggest oil and gas companies, and we found that NBIM is really lagging behind other investors, peer investors, in voting positively on climate at some of the largest oil and gas company AGMs. So NBIM voted against climate resolutions at all the 4 major oil and gas company AGMs, BP, Shell, Total, and Marathon, all of which have been declared inadequate in relation to climate alignment by a group called Climate Action 100, who have assessed the transition plans. So NBIM voted against climate resolutions. They voted against proposals to align Scope 3 climate targets with the Paris Agreement at BP and Total, even though in NBIM's climate action plan, their expectations to companies, they say companies should set science-based interim emission reduction targets that cover Scope 1, Scope 2, and material Scope 3 emissions. So even they say that that's their expectation, but they actually voted against setting Scope 3 targets at BP and Total. And so that's just... they have various reasons that they use. One reason they often use is if a resolution if they consider it too prescriptive, meaning they think it's too detailed, they will automatically vote against it, even if the resolution clearly says that there should be reduction targets. So they have a clause that they often use to reject resolutions if they're too detailed. So now, of course...
But isn't it better if it's more detailed? Because the more detailed there is, the more, the more it's easier to keep a company accountable instead of making a general statement.
Absolutely. But NBIM is very clear that they don't want to be seen to be micromanaging a company. So they think that they're invested in the company, but if they want to show that they have faith in the board, basically. So now when people are writing climate resolutions, people like Follow This, who are an advocacy organization to influence fossil fuel companies, now when they write a climate resolution, they try to be not detailed, but still be able to get their message across. So it's really, an excuse, I think, to reject climate resolutions on details. So overall, when we looked at how NBIM voted in 2023, they voted for the climate, so good votes for less than half the time. And they supported a climate harmful strategy more than half the time, 9 out of 16 climate resolutions. And so if you think about how much influence NBIM has in those companies, for example, NBIM owns 3.5% of BP and 3% of Shell. They're often the biggest individual shareholder in those companies, and they have supported them for many years. If you look at other investors who have realized that those companies have to transition, other investors supported the climate resolution. They said because they supported resolutions that were asking for Paris-aligned emissions targets at those companies. And also other big investors around the world managed to support those resolutions. And also the main Norwegian banks voted for climate resolutions. So NBIM really sticks out in many cases that they didn't support the resolutions. And like I said, the major Norwegian banks, Nordea, Storebrand, DNB, and KLP, which are the biggest Norwegian banks, they voted for the climate resolutions at all the 5 oil companies, Shell, BP, Total, Exxon, and Chevron, while NBIM voted against the climate at 3 of these, at Shell, BP, and Total. So really, it's the bare minimum to support companies to set Paris-aligned targets. It's sort of basic. And the thing is to remember is that the results of AGM votes are not even binding. You're just voting on something, but it doesn't bind the company to anything. So really, you're just giving an indication of which direction you want the company to go. So to not even say that you want climate to be important is, it's very poor, in my opinion. And as we talked about, oil companies are making it very clear that they're not committed to transitioning away from fossil fuels. And investors, including some investors, such as the NBIM, the Norwegian Oil Fund, are saying, okay, that's fine. We just reflect the world as it is. We're not responsible for shaping it. But they don't realize they are driving it. They are providing the money and the support to these companies. The investors, the money drives the whole machine. So if the big investors didn't support the fossil fuel companies and instead pumped money into sustainable companies, that would be reflected in the world around us. They can't do that.
And I was just thinking that 3% for a company like BP or Shell is huge. So if NBIN were to sell their entire share,
exactly,
one day from the other, their share price would plummet really fast.
Yeah, they can't just divest quickly like that. So that is actually why they have decided to stay invested. But their reasoning is that they are going to try to influence from the inside. So you would expect that they were trying to do that, but they're really not in the way that they vote. And so if they did use all their engagement to try to influence the company, then in terms of their votes and suggesting shareholder resolutions, it would impact what products are on the market, and it would impact those companies to transition. So the money and the support provided by investors, such as the oil fund, such as NBIM, is the fuel that drives the engine of the world economy, and it shapes the reality that we live in. So they are having a big influence. You mentioned the oil company Shell as an example. This year, a group of 27 investors who own 5% of Shell, so a little bit more than NBIM, but 27 investors got together and they tabled a climate resolution at Shell, asking them to support the company to align its existing 2030 Scope 3 emissions reduction target covering greenhouse gas with the goal of the Paris Climate Agreement. It's quite a basic ask. It's just saying, align your Scope 3 targets. So 27 investors decided that this was a good thing to do, and they wanted to influence the company from the inside. And NBIM voted against that again in 2024. So it sort of just shows that investors can do things, and there are investors who are trying to influence the companies, but some are not. And you probably, I think I mentioned it, but Shell recently abandoned a key climate target for 2025, and it weakened its goal for 2030. So it falls short for long-term reduction targets, medium-term targets, short-term targets, decarbonisation strategy. Their climate governance and climate policy engagement are inadequate, and it meets none of the criteria for a just transition. So that's an example of Shell, and NBIM did not vote for Shell to focus on their Scope 3 emission targets.
That's really concerning. So do you have, in an ideal world, what would NBIM do?
Well, the oil fund, at the moment, it does seem to be very short-sighted with its continuing support for an industry that doesn't have a future if we're to have a livable world. They seem to be being quite naive by continuing to believe in companies' weak transition plans. They said they believe that Shell is transitioning, even though the transition plan has been shown to be inadequate. And it's taking risks with the oil fund money by remaining passive in the transition. They're taking risks with the money that belongs to all of current and future Norwegian citizens. That is actually the Norwegians' fund. It's for the Norwegians' people. They're taking risks with that money, and they're taking risks with the future world that they, the Norwegian citizens and the rest of the world, will live in by financing the climate breakdown. So investing and supporting companies is really an active choice. It's not a passive state. So our recommendations to investors such as MBIM would be, at a minimum, to vote in favour of climate resolutions that are aligned with internationally agreed climate goals. This is essential at the highest emitting companies who are continuing with harmful strategy and business practices. And then another thing, so they should vote in favour of climate resolutions that are internationally important. They should really vote in accordance with their own stated climate expectations. Their climate action plan states what they believe in, and it all sounds pretty good, but they don't vote in alignment with their own climate transition plan. So MBIM has to really work out how they can make sure they are voting. They have to walk the talk, basically. And then they should also, it would be great if they also filed their own shareholder climate proposals at the major fossil fuel companies, because that sends a big signal to other investors. If MBIM filed its own shareholder proposals, and they have done a few shareholder proposals. I think in 2023 they proposed 4 shareholder resolutions. They withdrew 2 of them, so they had 2 at some quite small companies, none of the big companies. So it is something they could do, but then they haven't used their influence as well as they could.
Sorry, I was just thinking, when you're working as part of a team and there's someone there's always saying no to other people's ideas, well, bring your own idea then.
Yes. Well, exactly. I think, they do have to realize that banks and institutional investors and sovereign funds are not neutral. The support that they provide shapes the reality that we live in. So they have to use all the influence that they can. And if they decide to continue to invest in harmful companies, they need to use their influence and at very least use their vote to steer the company away from harmful activities. And they need to do it now. They just have once a year, they have an AGM, and they're not even using their vote very well there. So that would be my message.
Thank you, Lucy. I have one last question for you, which is, in all of this, is NMIM acknowledging your research? Are they speaking to you? Are they replying to you? What's their view?
We did send them the report. They haven't replied directly, but they have become more transparent and vocal about their voting. They have been. They publish how they're going to vote 5 days before an AGM. They've been doing that for quite a few years, and now their votes are published on Bloomberg, so people can very easily see how they voted. So that's not in direct response to this report, probably, but there's an acknowledgement that they do have to be a lot more open. I would prefer it if they. I mean, it's great that they're open, but they need to actually use their vote and properly.
Of course. Well, thank you so much. And thanks for the great work that you do, because we really do need to keep these big funds accountable. We will add links to your research in the show notes. And to our listeners, thanks so much for following us. Remember to follow us on social media. Go and check out The Future in Our Hands. And see you next week.